May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. And let the church say,
Amen.
Please be seated. The road to Damascus. That first reading that we did from Acts is kind of in the greatest hits of Bible passages. That blinding light from heaven upon Saul on the road is as well known in the popular imagination as it is in the church. A metaphor borrowed by screenwriters, journalists, and novelists as a way to illustrate that big aha moment. For Saul, who later becomes Paul, it defines his moment of total transformation of mind and of soul and even of body. It's a bright light accompanied by a voice, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? The voice identifies himself as Jesus, as the risen Christ. And it's important when Jesus says, I am the one whom you are persecuting, because he regards Paul's crimes and violence against the world's most vulnerable people as crimes against Jesus himself. This past Friday, I attended and participated in a conference led by Long Island Jobs with Justice entitled Working But Still Poor, Organizing for Justice in a Troubled Time. I won't put her on the spot, but the executive director is here with us this morning. I'll put her on the spot later. As a large gathering of Long Islanders making good trouble, we're able to find some light shining in our present darkness. We also acknowledge that in these times, it can be really hard to believe in total transformation. I just want to touch on two key points from our first reading today. First, Paul's name change and what that means for us. And second, whether or not we can come to believe in true transformation even in today's climate. Now, I know, even the transformed Paul, well, he had his issues, for sure. And I won't go into a full-throated Pauline critique here. That's another sermon entirely. But let's just say I've come to accept Paul for who he is, a man transformed, still imperfect like the rest of us, who remained a work in progress, but tried to keep walking toward that light and kept trying to hear the voice of God, calling out to him right up until his death. So let's look at Paul's transformation. Before his road to Damascus moment, when he was Saul, he was a really bad guy. He was actively persecuting Jesus' followers, probably not yet called Christians. Saul was an oppressor, an ugly henchman for the empire, persecuting and killing these people, our theological ancestors, who were among the first people to bring the love of Jesus into a broken world, bringing ideas of inclusive love, of redemption, and introducing a resurrection theology. And Saul, as an agent of the state, was one of the forces trying to destroy that message of love and peace. But that was Saul. After his transformation, he is renamed. And this renaming has deep roots in our biblical tradition. Jacob, after wrestling with the angel throughout the night, is forever changed, and God renames him Israel. Abram and Sarai, formerly non-Jewish pagans from Mesopotamia who worshipped idols, after making their covenant with God, they're renamed Abraham and Sarah. Saul has been rescued out of the place of death and darkness and despair, and in his new skin, he is called Paul. And I want to lift up the deep significance of his name change. In my prior vocation, I was a legal services attorney. And about 20 years ago, me and a colleague, who eventually became my life partner, who's sitting in the front row, we created a legal name change booklet for clients to use as a guide for the process in civil court. And it would be used by many different folks for a lot of different reasons, but especially for our transgender clients who are changing their legal names. Now, many folks who don't fully support trans rights will sometimes say, well, what's the big deal with the legal name? Or the pronoun thing? What's the big deal? But if you frame it in theological terms, you can see what a big deal it is. That we have a long tradition of holding one's name in a very sacred place. So anybody gives you a hard time about pronouns, tell them you got theological underpinnings and a priest told you so. A name is way more than just a word. Saul to Paul represents a deep ontological shift from persecutor to biblical prophet. Jacob to Israel takes him from dishonest trickster to Jewish leader and patriarch. Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah usher them into history as the parents of monotheism. I was so happy when I read a few weeks ago that some of our Anglican and Episcopal colleagues are implementing name change ceremonies into our liturgy. Your rector might have even talked about that with you already. A way of reintroducing oneself into the faith community as one's true, authentic self, symbolized by re-entry in the body of Christ with one's new name. And that's just one example of the power of a name. In many Native peoples' traditions, one name might shift over the course of a lifetime, reflecting the growth and change of a person and how we become differently situated in the world as our lives progress. But the point is, Paul's being renamed by God here is not just a side note in the story. It has deep, meaningful, theological roots vis-a-vis his spiritual transformation. The transformation and the renaming are inseparable. And this has deep theological meaning and application for us as well. The second point that I want to make is to ask, in today's troubled times, whether or not we can come to believe in true transformation. In the biblical story of Saul turning to Paul, the transformation is like that, right? Super quick. Although I think that through God's inspiration and guidance, biblical writers might have times sped up or collapsed timelines, delivering a message that would be more digestible for us and perhaps easier to grasp more quickly. Because for us, growing up into our own authentic selves isn't usually one flash of blinding light on a road, right? Back in Advent 2016, anybody remember what was happening back then? There had just been this little election. Okay. Anyway, I was kind of struggling with a belief in true transformation. But I ran across a story that gave me renewed hope when I really needed it. And I still reflect on it quite often. It's the story of Derek Black. Eli Saslow published a book about him last September called Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. But I first heard about Derek Black almost 3 years earlier in the fall of 2016, and I read every article I could find. Since then, Derek has done TED Talks and been interviewed on Fresh Air, so you can hear all about him online. But when I discovered his story, it really knocked me out. He is now 30 years old, and his transformation started in earnest when he was about 20. Derek was raised to be the heir apparent of the white supremacist movement in America. His father, Don Black, had been the 6th Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and had created a now infamous website called Stormfront, the internet's first and largest American white nationalist website. His mother had once been married to David Duke, one of our country's most high-profile KKK members, and Duke is actually Derek's godfather. Throughout his childhood, he joined his parents at all of their white nationalist conferences. He was somewhat of a prodigy, an extremely bright and skilled speaker, and he was given the podium as early as 11 or 12 years old. He was immersed in white supremacist ideology from the day he was born. Back in 2008, just a few days after we elected our first black president, he was in the room when dozens of the world's most prominent racists secretly met to strategize for the years ahead. Their program agenda read, "The fight to restore white America begins now." From the very beginning, Derek had been taught that America was intended as a place for white Europeans and that everyone else would eventually have to leave. At one point, back in 1981, his father, Don Black, along with 8 other extremists, made plans to board a boat stocked with dynamite, automatic weapons, and a Nazi flag, and to take over the tiny Caribbean island nation of Dominica. Thankfully, his father Don was caught, arrested, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. But this was Derek's life. This was his life. It was all he knew. He even learned web coding and designed a special children's section of their white supremacist website. He was their rising star. When he was about 20, he enrolled at the New College of Florida, a liberal arts college about 3 hours from his home. At first, the very diverse student body on campus knew nothing about it, and Derek tried to keep it that way. He was flying under the radar. But as he got to know these people, he grew to like them, and he even grew to love them. And eventually, everything on, as we know, everything on the internet is found sooner or later. And they found out who he was. A student posted information about his past on the campus message board, understandably to warn people that a neo-Nazi was in their midst. But through his relationships with others, Eric had already started to transform. After considerable discernment, the other students ultimately decided that ostracizing him wouldn't accomplish anything. As one student said, "We have a chance to be real activists and actually affect one of the leaders of the white supremacy movement in America. It would be a victory for civil rights." So remarkably, a group of students, Jewish, Black, gay, Latino, started reading Stormfront, the racist website that Derek's father had started, and listening to Derek's radio show so that they could see what, if any, rationale he had for his beliefs. They decided to invite Derek to a Friday night Shabbat dinner every week that was hosted by a Jewish student, Matthew, a classmate and acquaintance of Derek's. Naturally, Matthew had strong reservations about doing this, but he decided his best chance to affect Derek's thinking was not to ignore him or confront him, but simply to include him. So, every Friday night, they said the traditional Jewish prayers and blessings in Hebrew, even though most of the guests were Christian, atheists, Black, Hispanic, all different backgrounds. Derek spent hours and hours in quiet, respectful conversation with this very diverse and very patient group of new friends. And the outer shell gradually began to fall away. A few years later, by the time the 2016 election came, the transformation of mind and heart and life of Derek Black had processed dramatically. He wrote, "I could easily have spent the night of November 8th elated, surrounded by friends and family thinking, we did it. I'd be planning with other white nationalists what comes next and assessing just how much influence our ideology would have on this administration. But that's who I was a few years ago." He went on to say, "I spent the election wondering how much my movement had set the stage for this. Now I see the anger I was raised with rocking the nation." He says that people always ask him for clues on how to change the minds of others who still hold beliefs that he once did. But he said he can't offer any magic answer. That kind of persuasion, he said, or what we in the church would call transformation, metanoia, happens in person-to-person interactions, and it requires a lot of honest listening on both sides, he said. He said that the conversations that led him to change his views, to transform, started because he couldn't understand why anyone would fear him. He realized that to others, he embodied that nest of vipers that Isaiah refers to as a threat to their children. I think that's part of what Derek Black heard on his road to Damascus. It dawned on him that they were talking about him. He later wrote how it felt incredibly good to trust people, trying to interact without prejudice or judgment. He felt free. He felt reborn. In a recent interview, Eli Saslow, the author of the book, stated that Derek feels haunted by the fact that he spent the first 22 years of his life spreading hate, something I wonder if Saul went through internally as well. He said that Derek's trying to figure out how to forgive himself, whether to forgive himself, and how to engineer the rest of his life towards something important and purposeful. Ironically, he's getting a PhD in the study of medieval Islam. Interestingly, Like Saul/Paul, Derek Black has also changed his name. It might also be for privacy or safety reasons, but I can't imagine that that decision is unrelated to his spiritual transformation. He will continue to grow and evolve and grow into his new skin. Many might forgive him, some might not. But what I am most interested in is his transformation and how he was deeply blessed by a transformative community in a little college in Florida who saw something redeeming in him. Somewhere along the way, there was a commitment by his friends to let the love of God, through all of them, perform a miracle of transformation. Paul's transformation was as sudden and dramatic as a bolt of lightning. Derek's transformation was surely dramatic, but also gradual. For some of us, it might be a road to Damascus moment, but I think most of the time, it's about our smaller daily transformations which, patched together, create a larger transformative path, or several transformative paths. It's easy to become cynical and say, people can't really change. And it's true that we don't witness these transformations nearly enough. But just because we don't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it can't happen. My faith in people's ability to be truly transformed is still a work in progress, I must confess, so I understand your skepticism. But in this Easter season, we need to look everywhere in our world for the post-resurrection Jesus. Whether he's a fisherman cooking breakfast for us, like in today's gospel, or a group of college students inviting us to a Shabbat dinner. We're going to find our Jesus in all kinds of places. We need to insist that the flash of light on the road to Damascus is still possible, especially in our season, this season of resurrection hope. Today, the psalmist, too, gives us that transformation hope. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you, and you restored me to health. You have turned my wailing into dancing. You have put off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. You've clothed me with joy. As a rabbi friend of mine said this past week, joy is an act of political and spiritual resistance. Joy is an act of political and spiritual resistance. May the joy of true transformation be with you today and every day. Amen.
Amen.